Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And Tracy, our prior and beloved guest, Byrn, has a new book out.
Yep.
That book is Baking in the American South, 200 Recipes and Their Untold Stories. And her last two historical baking books, which were American Cake and American Cookie, were very popular with our listeners. So, of course, we had to have her back to talk about this book. Anne's knowledge of baking is utterly unreal. She knows the history of what seems like everything that has ever been baked. And she's talked to everyone who has ever baked a thing. So this conversation is a mix of historical information and some baking tips. And if we're being very honest, things that I was just plain curious about.
Yeah. So let's jump right in.
Anne Byrn, thank you so much for being back on the show.
It's great to be here, Holly.
You are I don't want to talk bad about any of my other guests, but you're my favorite guest we have on the show.
Oh, I'm honored.
It's true because you're delightful and you talk about delightful food and you're a really good food educator, which is what I really love.
Oh, thank you.
Your new book, Baking in the American South, is a tome. It's big. It's full of information. But what I love is that you open it by telling the story of someone asking you why Southern baking is so special when you were doing a book event for a previous book you wrote, and it stumped you a little bit. Why do you think it's so hard to quantify what's special about Southern baking?
Because it's rooted in memory. And I think as a writer, I was concerned that, my memories were really affecting my judgment there. It's because my mother was a fabulous cook and baker. So I started thinking, am I wrong? I mean, maybe not everybody comes from that sort of warm and fuzzy background. I mean, maybe the Midwest, the baking is just as good as it is in the South. And so I got concerned, but the audience at that book signing, they really backed me up. I mean, hands started going in the air, and it's your mother's recipe. It's the land, it's the people, it's the food. And that was really the beginning of this project, and it was a perfect beginning. Yeah.
One of the things that I really, really have always loved about your writing is you don't shy away from any of the difficult or problematic parts of a recipe story or a baking tradition story. And you kind of bust the myth about the romanticized South and what people think it is right out of the gate in the introduction. Will you talk a little bit about that, how we have this false memory as a culture about what the South is and was?
Yes, we do. We think it's all magnolias and moonlight or Gone with the Wind. But the South was largely poor and rural and isolated and not very glamorous. And I think for that reason, I opened the book with cornbread because it was the bread that fed people. That's the simple answer.
When you say you open the book with cornbread, that's a little bit of an understatement because it's like an entire chapter of dozens?
22 to 24, I think, exactly, recipes for cornbread. Yeah, it's fascinating.
It is fascinating. Will you talk a little bit about, when you say it's what fed people, why is it that bedrock base recipe?
Yeah, because corn grew everywhere in the South. And Southern baking is tied to the land and to the people. It's those two factors. And cornbread is the land because corn could grow pretty much in every of the 14 states. People would grow it in the back. They could grind it themselves or mill it, have it milled locally. And you could make corn griddle cakes, cornbread. It filled people up. And I think that that's a large part of Southern baking is just getting fed and not being hungry.
Right.
And scarcity is another big part of Southern baking. And corn kind of, made it possible to have a meal. And that's, made with lard, smothered with molasses. It fed people. And so that's why, to me, cornbread started this book.
It's also one of those great things that you alluded to it by talking about using lard or molasses or whatever. It bridges the divide between sweet and savory. It can go anywhere it needs to.
Bridges the divide between sweet and savory and bridges the divide between black and white and rich and poor.
Yeah.
And I think cornbread is like the connector of all foods.
Yeah.
It brings us together. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from. People love it.
You also talk a little bit in the book about varieties of corn, which informs this whole discussion of cornbread.
Right.
Will you talk a little bit about how all the different kinds of corn impact all of these recipes and what we know about how to cook with it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there were old varieties of corn like Bloody Butcher, which is red, and you love that. You'd have to love that one.
Yes.
And Hickory King, which is hard white, and Pencil Cob, which was yellow. And I think it's just, don't you just love the names of all these? John Hawk. And then, so I think of it agriculturally, a type of corn might have grown in a certain area of the South. And so that became the corn that was ground that was used in the cornbread for that region. And I think even today, when I interviewed people across the region, I found that there were certain parts of the South that were prone to bake with yellow cornmeal. West Tennessee, Arkansas, East Texas. Whereas there are other regions of the South, Mississippi, Middle Tennessee, North Carolina, that lean to white cornmeal. And a lot of it had to do with that's what was grown in the area. Yeah.
There's another thing that I love many things in this book, but you very transparently talk about how to measure ingredients and how you measured ingredients for these recipes, right? I know a lot of us who are not Ann Burns will read a recipe, and when we read like 1 cup of brown sugar packed, it's like, well, how packed? How densely do we? And you lay out for all of the key ingredients, like what those words mean in this book. But I also have to marvel a bit because you're talking about that and like the precision of baking at the same time. A lot of your book talks about how this is a baking tradition from memory. A lot of people that didn't really measure kind of measured with their heart and eyes.
It's true.
How did that work? Is it alchemy?
There is alchemy in baking for sure. And I think I tried to touch on both of those aspects, Holly, because on one hand, we know our grandmothers might not have measured, or they used a teacup to measure flour, or did they dig down in the sack and pull it up, which was just brimming with flour, or did they spoon it and level it off? You're right. It all depends on the maker, and we don't know what the maker made, but we can test the recipes today and make sure they work. And then when I give you the recipe, I can give you the option of, 2 cups of flour or 240 grams of flour.
Right.
And so if you want to be really precise, get a digital scale, and there you go. And you can make all the biscuits, cornbread, yeast rolls, cakes, whatever you want in my book with precision. Or if you don't want to do that, keep using your cups.
Right.
And this is how I measure a cup. Yeah.
I feel like you have also solved the question that many people are always asking, like, why were my grandmother's biscuits the best biscuits I ever had? And it's like, well, she had her version of measuring and nobody else had quite the same amount. Everybody probably had slightly different variations.
True. And it mystifies a lot of people because that scenario was throughout this book, trying to create recipes that are out of memory. Yeah.
This is, as I said, you're such a good food and cooking communicator. And one of the things that you talk about early on in the book that I was like, how have I never bumped into this before, was the idea of slow ovens and quick ovens and how that translates to the ovens we're using today that are much more precise.
Right.
Will you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I have I think it's a table in the introduction part of the book that came from a writer out of Kentucky. And he was the one, and I credit him. He was the one who shared the understanding your oven. And so a slow oven in grandmother's recipes is 300 degrees, moderate 350, quick oven, that's what my grandmother used to call it, quick or hot oven, that's 400, and very hot 450. But I think if you're looking at old recipes, family recipes, and you see these terms, that's how, you can set your oven today, because not all ovens had thermostats. Ovens have not always been born with thermostats. Thermostats came later. And I think another part of it is, obviously there were wood-fired ovens and coal-fired ovens and gas ovens, then electric ovens. And I think that's why the wood-fired oven could be why the South has made such great biscuits, because that high heat of that oven, think about that, makes that quick rise. It creates a lot of steam in a wet dough, and the biscuits go straight up. And several of the biscuit recipes in the chapter use like a 500-degree oven, and it's really trying to mimic an old wood-fired oven. It's really fun.
Do you have a favorite biscuit recipe?
Well, I have a lot of them because I have about 24 of those, too.
Well, and I know one of the things you talk about with some of the people who you've interviewed and who shared their recipes, like they have myriad different favorite biscuit recipes depending on what it's going to be used for,
That's right.
what it's eaten with. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Definitely. I think Natalie Dupree was the one. I love Natalie. And I asked her that question early, what's your favorite biscuit? What's the best way to make biscuits? And her reply was, well, it just depends on what you're doing with the biscuit. Are you putting a slice of pork tenderloin in it? Are you putting a piece of fried chicken in it? Are you just smearing it with honey? And I think that's really true because there can be very crispy, crunchy biscuits baked at high heat. And a cathead biscuit is just a big old drop biscuit, and it got lots of craggly edges. But then you can also make cake pan biscuits, like Shirley Collier's recipe that's very wet dough, but they're all squeezed in like a 9-inch cake pan. And so when they bake up together, they all smoosh together like they're in an elevator or something. And then you pull them apart. And so, if you like the soft in the center kind of biscuit, that's your recipe. If you like something crispy and crunchy and tall, go for Scott Peacock's biscuits or the cathead biscuits. So it just really depends on what you gravitate to.
What you like the most and where it's going. There is another technique you talk about in the book that I feel foolish because I don't know that I've ever seen it called this before or understood what it was, which is the falling oven technique.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, oh, this is genius. But also, so I want you to explain what that is for our listeners. And also, just for my own personal interest, is that hard to regulate given that some ovens will retain heat longer than others? Like, is there a trick to learning when you need to adjust for your own kitchen?
Probably. And yet ovens do differ. Think about it. Some ovens preheat in 15 minutes. Some take 10. Some take 20. I had one that at one time that took 25 minutes to preheat and it drove me crazy. So it's not as scientific as you'd like. But a falling oven is sort of trying to mimic what we're talking about wood-fired ovens, trying to mimic that whole idea. Because if you had a wood-fired oven, it started out hotter than it would later. As you were baking something longer, the temperature in the oven would reduce. It would get cooler. And that's kind of what the falling oven technique is, maybe to start a recipe, a cake, at a higher heat to promote browning, or a bread that's very dense, and then bake it for 30 minutes at 375, 400, and then you turn it down. While you never move it out of the oven, you just reduce the oven heat to 350. And then 20 minutes later, you reduce it to 300. And then 20 minutes later. And that is to set a recipe for bread, cake, whatever, and then to be able to cook it to the center without it getting too dark and too overcooked on the outside and not done in the middle. That's called a falling oven.
It's like searing a piece of meat, but in baking
Yeah,
concept.
definitely. Yeah. And then there's the reverse of that, which is the cold oven method, which is used for pound cakes, where you actually put the pound cake in a not preheated oven. And then once it's in, you turn it on to 350. And essentially that cake is going to start baking as the oven heats up, and that's called a cold oven technique.
And then does that keep it more dense as it goes instead of the rise?
Exactly. It makes a very compact texture, finely grained, and it came out of the 1930s when a lot of people were scared of and trying to also be economical about baking with gas.
Yeah,
and not using as much.
I feel like this entire book is a little bit of a love letter to the South and Southern baking because you have spoken with, it seems like, every single person who has put a dish in an oven.
Mhm.
You know all of the people who are kind of famous in Southern baking. You seem to know when every single recipe started and when. Um, and it feels both very thoughtful and carefully planned out and also very joyful to me. It's a very joyful read. And you are a woman of the South. So I wonder, did you find yourself kind of falling in love with Southern baking in a new way? Did it change your relationship with all of these recipes, which you were probably mostly exposed to before you started the project?
Yes, it made me absolutely fall in love with the South, the entire region, and embrace our differences. I found that there was much greater diversity in the baking of the South than I ever imagined. And as quirky as something like a cherry nut pie and a chocolate tomato sheet cake is, or possum pie is from Arkansas, I mean, after making these recipes, how can I not love them, you
Right.
know? And I am a Tennessean, you know, fifth generation, but I fell in love with West Virginia and a grandmother Bailey's, you know, gingerbread recipe. And I fell in love with so much of South Carolina baking that I didn't know. I didn't grow up in the Low Country,
Right.
but just their love and how they've incorporated rice in so many recipes. And just the hardships, I think, that people went through. If you read about other people's lives through these recipes, it does make you so much more empathetic to what other people have gone through time.
Yeah. It is such an intertwining of heart and hearth throughout the whole thing. It's really beautiful.
That's a good way to put it.
Will you tell us kind of the short version of, I'm glad you mentioned South Carolina, the Carolina rice story and how important that is, not just to the
Yeah.
South, but really to the nation in a lot of ways?
Well, very much so. I mean, South Carolina it's a complicated story because rice production took place in South Carolina because of the climate, because of the soil, and also because of the enslaved people who were forced to come here from the western coast of Africa, which has been called the Rice Coast. So they were brought to South Carolina in the 1700s. They had not only a knowledge of rice cultivation, and they actually did the physical labor of digging canals and excavating, removing tree roots, miles and miles of work and backbreaking work. But they also were subject to malaria and all of the elements in that hot and humid cuisine. These people also brought a knowledge and memories of a rice-based cuisine. And so it only makes sense then that the breads, the croquettes, the waffles of that area would be based on rice. That was accessible. That's what they knew. And you see other influences in rice, like in New Orleans, the collage, more of a Caribbean and African influence into New Orleans cooking. And I think it's just, it's a very rich part of the South. It's a to read about it and to research it, it's a tragic part, you know, of our history. But it has been an integral part of Southern baking.
Yeah, I mean, this is a through line with, your other books about American cake and American cookies, where you're very open about a lot of the things that we have adopted and think like, these are Americana recipes, are really ones that came from Africa during the slave trade, which is
Right.
fascinating to think about because I think most people don't think about them that way unless they're really looking for the history. So I'm grateful because it makes us kind of reframe what all of that means.
Well, thank you. But rice and sugarcane both are important ingredients in Southern baking, but they're, they have their dark history.
Yeah. We have also talked a little bit on the show before about enrichment programs, but I am ceaselessly fascinated. So will you tell us a little bit from, your expertise, what enrichment programs were when it came to baking and why they happened?
And you're talking about the B vitamins and niacin. Yes. I think yes. And because we had a corn-based diet in the South and cornbread, corn it did not provide all of the nutrients necessary, and it did not provide niacin in particular. And so there was a lot of malnutrition and pellagra in the South. And so it was sadly found most often in very poor communities and in the diets at prisons. And
yeah.
And have you done shows about this? I'm sure
It's
you've done.
come up. It has never been the focal point, but I know we have talked about it in, sort of the developmental stage and how and when it happened.
Right. And I can't remember exactly what year it was that these studies took place, but they started to actually, some scientists started looking into, the diet and what was causing, these deficiencies. And I don't think they pinpointed it until tragically they actually studied the prison diets and gave the prisoners, and one group, had a more balanced diet and the other had just the diet based on corn. And that's where it was found, and then the federal government got involved, and then our grains in the U.S. were enriched, and that was called the enrichment programs. Interestingly, now that we've kind of swung back to some of the old heirloom grains, if you think about it, or instead of buying big flour that's been enriched, there has been a trend in the last 5 years or less in baking breads with locally grown flour, or people grinding their own wheat, grinding their own corn. And so it is going to be unenriched. But I think that our diet as a whole today is much more varied than it used to be.
Yeah, we have access to anything we could dream of,
and
really.
Vitamins, yes.
And vitamins. I want to talk more about recipes. This one is truly in service to my marriage because it's my husband's very favorite thing. And I actually had not ever looked into it. Will you tell us about where key lime pie came from and its origin? Because its origin is actually also a little...
It's a little gray. It's a little gray, yes. And I think on that recipe, well, we know key lime pie came from Florida.
The Keys.
That's right. And from the Keys. And I think it speaks to canned milk more than anything. So I think you look in a recipe, and that kind of is an example of how I went about sort of sleuthing and looking for the story behind these recipes, is that you look at the recipe and what are the key ingredients in that? Well, it's key lime juice and eggs and sweetened condensed milk. And so sweetened condensed milk was an ingredient of the islands and the coasts, because you know that if you didn't have access to fresh milk, you use canned milk. And the Keys were cut off from the rest of Florida for a long time. Yeah. And it wasn't until railroads came in, and then with hurricanes coming into the Keys routinely through the years, bridges would get washed out. So they
still do.
They still do. This is right. Nothing much has changed. But I think that was a shelf-stable recipe. But it is that story, the story that's in here, and I'm searching for it, was the family, and it was the man who owned all of, the hardware stores.
Yeah.
Did he? And he cornered the market on all the sweetened condensed milk, right? And it was his cook who actually, and he owned 3 or 4 mansions. Have you done stories on him?
No,
in
but
Florida?
I kind of want to now after reading that in your book.
I think you kind of need to, because I actually tracked down a chef historian in Florida. I think it was David Bailey, I think is his name. And then then there's an island, the Keys longtime resident. This guy was named David Sloan, and the New York Times interviewed him. That's what it was. And he talked about William Bill Money Curry. That was the name of the guy who made his fortune in stockpiling sweetened condensed milk. But it was his cook who supposedly made the first key lime pie.
Delicious. Thanks, cook. We love it the most. Okay, this is another selfish question. Anne Byrn, why did I have to be in my 50s before I found out about cantaloupe cream pie? Why were you holding out on me?
Well, Holly, I was in my 60s when I found out.
I don't think I've ever been so excited to see a recipe in my life and not ever have heard of it before.
I felt the same way. I felt like it was a Christmas present.
Yes.
Yes. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Because I love cantaloupe.
Yes, I love it too. I love the Athena melons, right? In July when they come in season.
All of it.
So sweet. And that was one of those recipes. People ask me too, how many times do you test a recipe that goes in the cookbook? And I'll say, well, it depends on the recipe. Well, let me tell you, this recipe took about 12 times, but I was insistent because I knew there was something here.
Right.
I knew what this pie was going to taste like. It was going to taste like cantaloupe, and it was going to have this big meringue on it. but you have to have enough juice that goes into the custard that you stir on top
Right.
of the stove for the filling. And so you really need to use a really ripe cantaloupe. And that's the story behind this pie. This pie is it talks to us about railroads and what railroads brought to the South. And they brought ingredients because you could be living in nowhere, Alabama, and all of a sudden, you could get access to cantaloupes that maybe had come in from East Texas. And it was because of the railroads. And then the railroad cars would also have access. And some of the trains that had, the passenger trains that had dining in them, there were cooks on board. And the cooks would actually use ingredients that they had picked up at the last stop. And this cantaloupe pie story is one of a cook who had a surplus of ripe cantaloupes, and there's only so much he could cut up for breakfast,
Right.
and needed to use it up. And it was not only he felt like he needed to use up, and he didn't want it to go to waste, but his job sort of depended on it, and he needed to show his bosses that he had the ability. You talk about the ultimate mystery basket,
Right.
Make a pie with this, yeah.
Whatever we picked up at the last one.
Yeah.
Listen, I'll make cantaloupe things all the time.
You're going to love it.
Cantaloupe syrup is one of my favorite things
I
to make
love
for
it.
a cocktail. It's so good.
Ooh, yum.
Oh, a Collins made with cantaloupe syrup is like summer to me.
Nice.
Yes. And then your leftover cantaloupe from it is like a compote you can spread on
Exactly.
whatever.
Yeah.
Toast. It's
Love
delicious.
it. Love it.
Cantaloupe everything. My husband is allergic. Too bad.
Oh, it's too bad.
I will eat all the cantaloupe. Are there any recipes I haven't hit on that you want to talk about because you love them so much or think they're especially important parts of this story?
Wow. Well, we've talked a bunch about pie. That's so interesting. Pie has
Pie is
come up.
very popular.
You know, I do love the pudding chapter. I think, and someone has said, I think this is the first cookbook I pulled out, and you have an entire chapter dedicated to pudding. And I do. Pudding, you think, is British, and the whole category of desserts is called pudding, for the Brits. But I'm talking about the soft and creamy, comforty stuff.
Right.
And so that's what I've got. So it's a mixture of banana pudding, which is probably the South's #1 dessert.
Mm-hmm.
And bananas, that is also a railroad recipe. Bananas coming up from Mobile and New Orleans into the rest of the country. But also rice pudding, which is old. That's I've got an old Maryland recipe. And that recipe came out of an old cookbook that was written after the Civil War, which then informed me how a lot of the first cookbooks in the South were written as charitable cookbooks, and it was written as relief work. And they unknowingly have preserved the recipes of the South, the 19th century recipes, because they wrote them down. And I think we were talking earlier about how not all cultures, not all the people that came into the South wrote down recipes. There are a lot of them, the English and the Scottish and the Irish, they were all talk,
Right.
Storytellers. They didn't write things down. The German cooks that came into the South through the Midwest and down through, Kentucky, Tennessee, they wrote things down. The Jewish cooks, that came into the South through Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, they wrote things down, and they also remembered them, and they repeated recipes during the holidays.
Yeah.
So I think that those early cookbooks help preserve the recipes. And a lot of the pudding recipes come out of those early books.
I love it. You also share a recipe that is your mom's recipe.
Oh, I do.
Will you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. Well, actually, I think there's two. There's the chess cake, and then there's her banana bread as well. Banana bread. Yeah, banana bread is because that's our personal favorite. That was just, how do I get this banana bread recipe in the book? And it goes in the quick bread chapter. There you go. It's a great banana bread recipe. It's real easy to do. And it's oil, not, butter. I think it makes a fuller flavored banana bread. And then there's the chess cake recipe in the cake chapter. And it's like a bar. It's like a blondie. But we call it chess cake in Middle Tennessee because it has the gooey consistency of like a chess pie.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
That one caught my eye because it just looked real. The photography in this book.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Ren Allen out of Athens, Georgia, was a photographer.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, she's quite talented. It's fabulous.
Like, everything looks really buttery and delicious.
It was buttery.
It's a mouth-watering set of pictures for sure.
Thank you.
And as I said, it's a tome. That's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's 200 recipes.
Here's a boring behind the veil question about that. When you're doing photography for one of your books, especially one like this, are those situations where you are churning out those recipes and dressing them for photography, or do you have a bunch of helpers? Is it you and the photographer? How does that work?
Well, it was both this time because we had 2 weeks of photo shoots.
That's not enough. There are a million recipes in here.
Correct. Yeah, that's right. And the first week, we had a fabulous stylist, Tammy Hardiman, and her assistant, Angela Hinkle. They were fantastic. So let me tell you, the first week, we did every complicated recipe in the book because I needed them. We did most of the pies because Angela was just fluting and crafting the crust, and Tammy did all the flourishes on top. But I also was in the kitchen stirring custard and making things. The next week, they went bye-bye, and it was me. And so we did all the biscuits and the cornbread. So I did. It's my hands that are in the book rolling the biscuit dough. So I think it's a little bit of both. We had some mishaps. You're going to the oven in the studio had a hot spot in it on the left-hand side. That beautiful pecan pie recipe, Zephyr Wright's pecan pie recipe, had got sort of torched on the left-hand corner. Oh, and it was so gorgeous. So, what do? You crop it 3/4.
Right.
And,
drape a beautiful flower over it.
Exactly. These things, anything can be fixed, right?
Right. And you would never know because the photograph does look absolutely gorgeous.
Thank you.
My last question. I think I've asked you this every time we've done one of these. And this one is a long haul book. You took a long time writing this. And as I said, you talked to what appears to be 1 million people. What was your biggest surprise along the way? Because it is such an incredibly rich, well,
I think back to the fact that the South is much more diverse, or the food, the baking from the South is way more diverse than I ever imagined. The other takeaway was that I, being a native Southerner, have just warm and fuzzy feelings about all of these recipes.
Right.
When I look at a meringue pie, I think of my mother. When I look at a pound cake, I think of my grandmother. When I look at spoon bread, which is like a corn souffle, I think of the other grandmother. But what I learned is that not everybody has those same feelings.
Yeah.
And that was part of the story that I wanted to tell, that much of Southern baking has been done by people who were not baking out of joy. And they were baking because they were forced to.
Right.
Or they were baking in Black cooks who were baking in other women's kitchen, white women's kitchen, and then they had to go home and bake and cook for their own family and raise their own children. And I always knew these things, but I don't think it really hit home for me that not everything that I consider joyful and comforting, other people feel the same way.
Right.
And I honor that. I do honor that. But there's got to be recipes that they do find joyful. And I found that pound cakes, to the Black community especially, tea cakes, are held in very high esteem. Peach cobbler. Yes. So that I learned that, we're all different. We can all have, memories. We can all collectively come together and appreciate a style of baking from a region that may not be anything like we imagine it is, and that we're probably more alike than we are different.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. Thank you for being here with me, but also thank you for this book. I feel like this is the book I didn't know I really, really wanted.
Thank you.
It's like a Christmas gift for it to exist. So for all of my historical bakers, you need it. Just trust. I literally am staring at the page for the New Orleans king cake recipe and going, well, I can make that in September. That's not a problem.
You can start now for January.
Thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you, Holly.
Oh, the best. The best. Thank you once more to Anne Byrn for her wonderful stories and baking advice.
The new book, once again, is Baking in the American South, 200 Recipes and Their Untold Stories, and that's available anywhere books are sold.
And you can also find Anne at annebyrn.com. That is ANNEBYRN.com. And on Instagram at Anne Byrn and on Twitter at Anne Byrn. Sign up for her newsletter. It's so good. Since we have baking talk, I thought it would be fun for listener mail to do one from one of our listeners who said it was silly, but it was also really quite charming to me.
Okay.
This is from our listener, Sarah, and she writes, you say you're not picky about what mail we send you, so I thought I'd send you this little thing that made me smile. I'd ordered from Too Good To Go, an app that sells discounted mystery bags from local restaurants of food that would otherwise have to be thrown out the next day. I paid $6.99 to see what Whole Foods would give me on a Friday night after a long week. It was about a 20-minute drive from the train station after work, so I was catching up on Wednesday's episode. That would have been our episode on Carvalho Montero. And Sarah continues, when I opened my bag, what was the first thing I pulled out? Portuguese rolls, fluffy soft carbs, and a funny coincidence. Now that's a great way to start a weekend. In case you're curious, the bag also has mini chocolate hazelnut beignets, a large ciabatta loaf, and some cherry turnovers. Definitely worth the price of admission. I hope you have a great weekend. That is very cool. And I like that this is eliminating food waste.
Yeah.
I know some bakeries and restaurants will turn over their stuff to shelters or food banks, but some municipalities don't let you do that, sometimes based on ingredients. You're not allowed to do that, I think.
Yeah, we have a food rescue group here where I live that does sort of a loop of grocery stores and restaurants and stuff and picks up a lot of food that would otherwise be discarded and then takes it to shelters where they have grab-and-go meals and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, which also harkens back to a previous episode on Auguste Escoffier, because as far as we could tell, he was the first chef that actually started that tradition. So Sarah, thank you for sharing your delicious picture of rolls with us. Man, I love a carb.
Yeah.
They don't always love me back, but I love them. If you would like to write to us to share whatever you're eating or your pets or just things you think about history, you can do so at historypodcast@iHeartRadio.com. You can also subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.
Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.